The Canadian Association of Accredited Mortgage Professionals just released its annual spring report on the mortgage market. Now, this report says the tightening that Ottawa has been doing on mortgage lending rules has been causing the housing market really to flag as an important growth engine for the Canadian economy. To find out more, we're joined by Will Dunning. He's Chief Economist at the Association of Accredited Mortgage Professionals. Will, thanks very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
But couldn't you say, I mean, rhetorically, it was necessary to do something to cool down the housing market, specifically the speculative portion?
What we saw was unnecessary was the changes in 2006, 2007, where the market was overheated and the regulations were made much more loose to allow 40-year amortizations with no down payment. And that clearly was much too far. There has been some retrenchment from that, and some of that retrenchment was well advised. Mm-hmm. But the final step to take away 30-year amortization and only allow up to 25 years amortization, that has really been a very big change for the housing market.
Really?
And it's just now starting to play out into the economy.
Why, you can't get it, that's if you want an insured mortgage.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Why is that such a big deal, just those 5 years?
Well, people were able to borrow very comfortably at 30 years, okay, and have lots of room in their finances to make their payments and pay for their other necessities.
Payments are lower over the longer period.
Yeah. But at a 25-year amortization, we would lose about 11% of first-time buyers out of the market because of that change from 30 to 25 years. And we've seen a corresponding reduction in housing activity. Starting in August last year, we saw a 9% drop in resale market activity, and that's continued to the present.
So you say that this is going to lead to a slowdown in housing construction.
That's right.
80,000 jobs are at risk directly by 2015, and then another 70,000 indirectly.
That's right. Housing starts don't change instantaneously when there's a change in the economy or in regulations. There's a long process leading up to construction. There's the sale of the home, there's the design of the home, there's getting ready for construction, and then starting construction. So it can take up to a year for that kind of change to start flowing through into housing starts. We're just now starting to see the reductions in housing starts. Housing starts averaged 205,000 per year during 2011, 2012. For April, the rate is down to 175, and I believe we're only halfway through that process. The process is going to continue to play out well into next year, by which point we'll probably be down to about 150,000 housing starts in Canada.
Well, you know, I understand your point. I guess the other point, or the other side of the coin is, you know, you hear from Julie Dixon, the head of OSFI, saying that if banks loosen their standards too much, that there could be a greater fallout. And we don't know what kind of job implications that could have, but that could have huge implications on that side if they're not too careful.
You know, I don't pretend to be able to talk about banks' balance sheets, okay?
Yeah.
But banks are lending into the mortgage market because that's where the opportunity is for them to lend profitably. Yes, they could reduce mortgage lending and take that stimulus out of the economy. The question is there another part of the economy that's going to pick up that slack and start creating the jobs that are going to be lost out of the housing sector?
Well, I mean, is there any evidence that the banks, in fact, have lowered their standards, though? Or is the consumer simply reacting to the fact that money is really, really cheap, and they're making a rational decision in relation to the cost of money, but in no other respect are they acting in a speculative or bubble-like manner?
If you look at the loans that have actually been made in Canada, the lending has been very cautious on the part of the lenders and the consumers. Yes, you can borrow up to a 32% GDS, but very few borrowers go to that, and typically it's 23 or 24% GDS.
Yeah.
There's a lot of room to accommodate a future rise in interest rates.
What's a GDS, just remind me?
Oh, sorry. Gross debt service ratio, the percentage of your income that goes to paying your mortgage payment, taxes, and utilities.
And give us those numbers again, if you would. Sorry.
32% would be a typical what's allowed.
Okay.
But a typical actual would be 23 or 24%.
Well, there's increasing calls now for the Bank of Canada to raise rates to deal with this issue. A lot of people feel that that's the real solution. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'd like to answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, I'm one of those who believe the next move for interest rates isn't going to happen for a while, and the next move is going to be downwards. Okay.
Oh, in Canada?
Yes.
You mean like short-term rates or mortgage rates?
Short-term rates. I don't think there's much more room for long-term rates to move. Some would argue with that. Yes.
Oh, wow. So then, but that could further stimulate the housing market.
Well, the second point I want to make, and thanks for bringing me back to it, is that the housing market was organically slowing under its own impetus prior to the policy change. The change was announced mid-June. If you look back at the data from the housing market, and even from mortgage lending, the rates, those curves were actually starting to turn down.
Anyway.
Anyway, early in 2012. So the rate of growth of mortgage lending was actually in the process of turning down towards a more moderate and sustainable rate. And housing activity as well had gotten to a point at which I would say in most places in Canada we had balanced housing markets. You know, we had stable prices, stable levels of activity. We had a stable market, and all of a sudden the government is taking demand out of the housing market. To me, that's a very risky formulation.
You still see, I mean, you see the Calgary and Edmonton market pretty healthy overall.
Yes.
Vancouver, I mean, that was a bit of, you can't deny that was a bit of a bubble.
Well, absolutely. You know, Calgary and Edmonton actually had a bubble. They had a fairly small bubble. It didn't do a lot of damage. But they took, like after all bubbles everywhere, it takes a long time for consumers to recover in the aftermath of a bubble. So actually, we were just seeing 6 months ago, a year ago, Calgary and Edmonton starting to get out of that funk and starting to see growth occurring in their housing market. Guess what? The rate of growth has been curtailed. So instead of being in a emerging recovery and a growth phase, they've gone into a sideways movement in those housing markets. You know, so the impact is felt there as well. It's just got a different dimension to it than we're seeing in most of the country, like Vancouver.
The debt to income ratio, I mean, this is what they're talking about, that it's right. Unsustainable right now. But you believe that most of the mortgage holders, they're healthy.
Oh, yes, most of them are. We have a lot of mortgage indebtedness in Canada. We've seen a generational move of people away from renting into home ownership over the past 15 years. You know, millions of Canadians have moved into home ownership over the past 15 years, and we've seen a lot of the growth in mortgage indebtedness as a result of that tsunami into home ownership.
We had Dan Werner of Morningstar on yesterday, and he is a bit of a skeptic on the Canadian housing market. He says you should look, when you drill into the loan-to-value ratios, they're not as healthy as you might think. He says almost 30% of insured Canadian mortgages have a loan-to-value ratio of 80% or more. And he said CMHC could be at risk itself if housing prices drop substantially.
If they drop substantially. So how do we protect housing values from dropping substantially? Or do we want them to drop substantially? I don't think we do. The best way to protect the housing market from movements either way is to have a stable economy, stable job creation. The housing market really starts in the job market. If we have healthy job creation, we should have a reasonable forward view of the housing market. But we're creating a situation in which the government is taking activity out of the housing market. It's going to take 150,000 jobs out of the economy, and that in itself is not going to contribute to a healthy housing market going forward. That's raising the risk of the kind of correction that some people are afraid of.
I mean, I think the other thing, somebody has to push back on some of this stuff that you hear, particularly that's coming from south of the border.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that 70% of the mortgages have a loan to value ratio better than 80%?
Yes.
Oh my God!
That's the good news.
That's an incredibly secure banking industry.
And that's in the insured mortgages.
And this is in a country where we didn't surrender the pen to a bunch of yahoos to do the assessments, etc.
And they loaned on crack.
So this guy from S&P is once again is sitting in
Morningstar in this case.
Morningstar. And he's sitting in Minneapolis or he's sitting in San Diego and he's imposing a U.S. model on the Canadian market. And like so many times we get this crap coming up from, sorry, I'm a little bit passionate on this topic. It's like Steve Eisman and his call on home capital.
We are going to talk about that.
Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story, right?
I think Will wants to jump in with the final shot here. Go ahead, Will.
Okay, we were talking about insured mortgages. We talked about all homeowners, including those who have uninsured mortgages and those who own mortgage-free. They have a housing... on average, they own 67% of the house, and they have a third of the house is mortgaged. So if we have $1 billion in mortgage debt, more or less, in the housing sector, we have $3 billion in assets backing that trillion dollars backing that. You know,
the glass is 3/4 full, you could say.
Well, 2/3.
Okay, right.
Sure.
Will Dunning, Chief Economist at the Canadian Association of Accredited Mortgage Professionals. We'll have to have both of you back.
My pleasure.
Hit you against one of these.
That'd be fun.
Thanks very much,
Will.
That was great.
All right, we're going to take a